We're on.
Okay, thank you. So good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us this morning for part of our regular Saturday series. I want to say two sort of things up front. First is to, as always, thank our teachers, our support staff, our EAs, everyone really associated with our school districts for the great work that they continue to do on behalf of students. I'm more amazed each day by the stories I hear and things that I know these people are doing each and every day. And I want to thank parents and our students as well for what I know is not easy, for what I know is not the routine, for what we've acknowledged any number of times is not public school, not what we do. And you've been terrific and supportive, and I've received lots of notes from people, and I know other people have as well, thanking us for what we've done and being supportive, and we really appreciate that. And I guess I want to say right back at you because you've done amazing in what are very difficult times. I want to the second thing I want to say before I introduce our guest this morning is that I think this may have been the roughest week we've had so far in all of this, because while I know you've heard me say, if you've been here with us, that that we knew because the governor had been hinting, we knew because of the data on what it would take to reopen our institutions, that we probably weren't coming back this school year to our physical plants for schooling. But there's something very different about actually hearing that, about hearing those words, about having that conversation. Superintendents had a chance for about an hour before the governor made his announcement the other day to talk with him directly. And there's just something very different about the finality of that. And while I feel, while what went through my mind when we heard that news was really about all of you, and what that would mean to people who teach here, people who work in facilities here, people who are parents here, our students. Probably for me, the two groups of people I thought about the most, maybe it's because I'd been with them the day before, were our seniors, our high school seniors, and what this means to them as they finish their high school careers. And as terrific as they were in a conversation that we had with them on Tuesday, that Mr. McGowan and I had with them, talking about a number of issues related to them finishing their high school careers at Winnicott, I can't help but feel for them. And the other group is not a group we talk about as often on these calls, but are people who are retiring this year. I've talked to a number of principals. I've actually talked to a couple of those teachers who are leaving us at the end of this year, who are retiring, and who surely didn't have this in mind as the way they would leave their storied careers in our school districts. They wanted to be with students. They wanted to be with their colleagues as we finished, and they're not going to have that opportunity prior to June 4th. And I just want to say what I've said a couple times. We are committed to finding ways to appropriately honor our graduating seniors, our 8th graders who are leaving their schools, and principals are already working on ideas. Our mantra on this is no idea is crazy, or is too crazy, I guess. Some of the principals are trying to test me a little bit on that, but no idea is too crazy. And I feel the same way about our retirees and what we do to make sure that they are appropriately honored as they leave their wonderful careers working with your children and working in these schools. So it's been a very difficult week. I'll speak personally and say it's been a difficult week for me hearing that news, and I know for the people I have an opportunity to work with. And so we could do a lot of things this morning. We could have continued our conversations about graduation and end of the year, and we could start talking about things we're already talking about, like summer programming and what in the world the beginning of next school year looks like, and all of those kinds of things. And so our thought this morning was that there's plenty of time for those things. We'll get right back at them on Monday morning and talk about them, I'm sure, next week. But what we decided to do today was hit the pause button on those things and invite a terrific colleague of ours, Raymond Pillsbury, who works as the Special Education Director, Student Services Director at Winnicott High School, and who also does a great deal of work around the state as a crisis response advisor. And I think I speak for the members of the senior staff here when I say that when we have a very tough issue that's in front of us that involves people, that involves the people we work with, that involves our communities, Raymond is the first place we go for that support and to help us think through the pieces, quite frankly, that maybe we would have missed in dealing with the technicalities of the issue. And so Raymond, I'm thrilled that you're here to talk with this group this morning. And personally, I'm thrilled that you're here because I need a boost of Raymond Pillsbury this morning. So with that, let me turn this over to Raymond. Raymond, you need to turn your you need to unmute yourself. Thank you.
Sorry. I thought that all happened behind the scenes.
We do lots of things, Raymond, but that's not one of them.
Right. Wonder number one of many, I'm sure. I have to start by saying how honored I am to be here. Not just as a part of this school community that's so receptive to really going to great lengths to ensure the well-being of our students, staff, and community members, but also because I have this amazing privilege of working alongside some of the most dedicated and compassionate professionals that I've had the pleasure to work with in my long and storied career. So, this is my first year as an administrator. If I'm being honest, what a way to start. As if learning a brand new role wasn't challenging enough, throw in a global pandemic to just spice things up, and that certainly made things a lot more interesting and challenging. But what I have been in awe of consistently since, with relation to this pandemic, as we all landed at the tail end of February break, where the conversation immediately began on how to ensure the well-being of the people in our school community. That really speaks volumes about where our priorities are as an SAU and school community. And admittedly, I'm biased about crisis response and wellness for staff and students, given my background. But that's why I feel so at home here, because we talk about those things, we think about those things, and we plan for them. There's been a lot of focus on the logistics up to date, but that's because we also need information in order to feel reassured that we know what's going on. So logistics are a real thing. Information is a real thing, and people find comfort in that. As Dr. Lupini said, we've devoted a lot of our focus the last month or so on ironing out logistics so that we could be prepared to do this and do this well. Still learning as we go, but to do it well. And the governor's announcement, while I would say that the majority of us saw this coming, there is something about the finality of it that even though it's information and it is important for us to know, sometimes realities can feel harsh when we learn of them. So I think the timing to talk about wellness for all of us on an equal playing field, because this is not an educational crisis, right? This is a world crisis, and it impacts us all to some degree. So to turn our conversation today to that, I think is a real responsible thing for us to do as a school community. I'm going to start by confessing a couple of things, and what I can see is my administrator colleagues in this room right now, and all of you can't. So I see them sort of take a breath. Like, what's he going to say now? Here's my confession. My confession is that if you're familiar with the adage, take my advice, I'm not using it, I'm the first one to say I'm guilty of that. I derive a great deal of professional satisfaction from being in the helper role, and I'm oftentimes not so great about being a role model with that. The beauty, though, is that every time I talk about it, and every time I make eye contact with people, and people are nodding, and we're engaged in a conversation about their well-being, that there's a parallel process that happens for me where I also remind myself the importance of taking care of my own well-being. So while I'm always not so great at it, I strive to be, and talking about it is a constant reminder. And what I'll revisit in this presentation is the way you can tap into that as well. The other confession is, so I've been doing this work for crisis response work and coordinating for nearly 20 years. Been all over the state consulting with other districts and other schools at times of significant crisis. I even spent a month being deployed to do disaster mental health in Houston after Hurricane Harvey and the mass devastation that occurred there. So I talk about this, and I do these kinds of presentations all the time. Here's why I lost so much sleep, though. You're my people, and I have been putting a great deal of pressure on myself to make sure that I could come up with the exact right words that I want my people to hear. And here's one of the things that I have seen to be true, is that there are a lot of words right now, partly because we're functioning in email land a great deal of the time, but also even advertisers on TV are capitalizing on certain catchphrases. And I worry sometimes that those catchphrases become kind of cliche and lose their meaning. So I'm going to take a slightly different approach in what I'm going to talk to you about today. The other thing is that because I couldn't sleep, I sent myself an inordinate number of emails in the course of the night. So I filled up my own inbox with my own emails because I wanted to be sure I remembered certain things. One of which was my refrigerator has developed a bit of an annoying hum, and I'm set up in my kitchen right now. My refrigerator is getting a lot of use, as you might imagine, being stuck at home all the time. So I had to email myself to shut my refrigerator off. And then an hour later, I emailed myself to be sure that I left a note to turn it back on, because that would cause more mass devastation for me that I wasn't prepared to cope with. So, and my dogs needed to be quarantined at a different part of my house, because along this time of day, it's when my golden retriever in particular starts bringing out all of his dog toys one by one to drop them at my feet. And as cute as that is, when I'm in the middle of a recorded presentation, that's frowned upon. So I've invited him to be in a different part of the house. So to keep myself on track, I wrote myself a bunch of notes. So I'll keep referring to them. And I also have a screen over here because there's a couple of things that I'm going to quote from. So I'm a little bit all over the place, but I'm very prepared, just not on sleep. All right. A word about self-care. So self-care conversations and recommendations is my go-to in crisis response work. What I think, though, is that we've been inundated with self-care suggestions in all sorts of different places. And all of that is very well intentioned, and I'm definitely not minimizing or negating the importance of that. What I want to be sure that I emphasize in this talk today is that a few things about self-care. First, self-care is not one size fits all. So one of the risks that I run with putting out tips on self-care is that there's an implied suggestion that this is the right way to do it. And I've already confessed that I struggle with that sometimes myself. So what you need to do is know yourself and listen to what you need and do that. That is self-care. Tips are just guidelines and some suggestions so that you might get some ideas on things that you hadn't thought about. But really pay close attention to what your experience is, what your needs are, what's worked for you in the past, and do those things, and do those things with confidence. If I were to give you a couple of pieces of advice, I would really strongly urge you to have it be as simple as possible. Sometimes we can overcomplicate self-care, and when we overcomplicate it, we run the risk of really not being able to follow through on giving that gift to ourselves. One of the things that we know to be true about the stress response in times of crisis is that it releases a lot of chemicals like adrenaline into our bodies. So there are some very basic self-care things that you can do that are free and simple and are really meaningful and important self-care. The first of which is drinking water. Those of you who've been in Zoom, countless Zoom meetings with me are constantly seeing me sip from my self-care fuel here. I promise it's just water. And staying hydrated is important because we know that, but also it helps to flush those stress chemicals from our system. And those stress chemicals that fuel kind of that fight or flight kind of response that we're hardwired to do, they're also very dehydrating. And when we're dehydrated, we're not at our best to be resilient. So the other thing is just stepping outside and getting a little fresh air. It's snowing where I am right now. I don't know about you. I wasn't expecting a snowstorm in late April, but there was a whole lot of things that I wasn't expecting right about now. So a snowstorm in late April, why not? And also just moving your body, going for a little walk, stretching, doing what you need to just sort of move your body because those stress chemicals kind of collect in your muscle masses. And if you can just move your body a little bit, you don't need to start a yoga routine or aerobics if that's not something that is realistic for you. But those are some real simple things that you can infuse into your day. But I think the most important self-care tip of all is extending yourself some grace, lots of grace, heaping spoonfuls of grace all day long, because we get so judgy about ourselves sometimes and forget to extend ourselves the grace to be able to say to ourselves, we're just doing the best we can. I even have visual aids. So all of my like school supplies are, well, at school. So I did the best that I could. I want to show you what the enemy of self-care is. And on my screen, it's backwards. I sure hope it's not backwards on yours, but you'll get the idea. So I should statements are the enemy of self-care, and I'll tell you why. Because that's putting a lot of pressure on yourself to conform to something that you think you ought to do, and that if you don't do, you're going to feel guilty about. So really, anytime you find yourself doing an I should statement, I would encourage you to, visual aid number 2, replace it with an I am statement. And then it's I am, and fill in some sort of a positive affirmation. And some days it's I am doing the best that I can. I'm a leave myself notes kind of guy. I literally pulled this off the mirror over my bathroom sink where I read it when I brush my teeth in the morning and at night. Literally, this is my reminder. I try to encourage myself to start the day with a positive I am statement and end it with a positive I am statement. Just a tip. Compassion. And this is what I was really hoping I could make central to this conversation today. The self-care tips, that's something that I think we have seen and read a lot about already, but I don't know that what we're seeing right now is a lot about compassion. And what I'm talking about is the kind of compassion that you not only extend to others, but you extend to yourself. So what I'm encouraging you all to think about doing is leaning into what you're feeling, leaning on others for support, and reaching out for support and to extend support liberally. Because one thing I know to be true about compassion, so long as it's tied to some good self-care at the same time, compassion is healing. And we all could use a little healing right now, not just because this is a health crisis, but also because this is an emotional one. I want to tell you a quick story. So when I was doing disaster mental health work in Houston, so they call in disaster mental health folks well after the storm has receded. So about a month after the floodwaters went away, the cameras went away, the first responders all went away, I was roving the streets that had at one time been completely underwater, just checking in on people in a little rental car that had a trunk full of basic supplies that I could dole out as needed. One of those supplies was socks. And so I stopped by the washed out home. It was still standing, but had been washed out home of an elderly gentleman. And he was sitting on his porch, and along the railing was a whole string of socks that were drying. And what we knew to be true in that work was that people could not dry out. It was humid, so there was no relief to be outside to dry off, and there was no way to really effectively dry out homes, particularly with folks who were not having the kind of resources that they needed. So this elderly gentleman was sitting on his front porch with a whole row of socks drying on the railing. So I pulled in, grabbed a couple of packs of socks from the trunk of my little rental car, and went up to him and started a conversation with him. And he invited me to sit down, which I did, and I set the socks on the porch floor beside me. And I want to tell you, the thing that we talked about the least was socks. We just talked about what this experience was meaning for him. And I just did a lot of listening and giving him some space to be able to just tell me what he wanted to tell me without interjecting, without trying to fix, even though I was definitely in an assigned helper role. And then I left the socks and thanked him for having the courage and the vulnerability to share with me what this was meaning for him. Those are the kinds of experiences that I have that are the most meaningful when I do crisis response work. So to that end, when we are talking with each other about how this feels for us, we do experience relief from that. Even though this is a shared experience because we're all living through a pandemic, we have to recognize that our responses to it are as different as we are as human beings. One of the things that we ought to kind of spend some time thinking about is what emotional responses that we're having. And I'm going to give you kind of a list of some emotional responses that can be even trickier to know what to do with when they're rising up for us, because they're very gray and not very black and white. And oftentimes there's not a lot of immediate relief from them. Some examples of that: powerlessness, uncertainty, loneliness, detachment, feeling overwhelmed, and guilt. Those are just some examples of emotions that we really, as humans, oftentimes have a real hard time knowing what to do with, because, as I said, there's not like an immediate remedy for that. And what we oftentimes mistakenly do is we make those feelings worse by trying to ignore them or judge ourselves about them. I want to make a note about guilt for you. So, I'm very fortunate that that people share their thoughts and feelings with me, and it's been really remarkable to me that people who are feeling like they're getting through okay, they're feeling pretty resilient, they're kind of rolling with it, have some guilt about that, and really don't feel comfortable sharing that with people because they feel like that there's something wrong with that, and that would be offensive to people. And again, that's that whole sort of standard that we set for ourselves about subscribing to a certain way of coping with this, or a certain set of emotions, or a certain expectation that we're just going to be immediately resilient without giving space for the fluctuation of emotions that we're bound to have, that are normal to have. What I hope that I can encourage all of you to do is to make space for your own varied emotions without judgment, and then to deliberately make space to invite others to share theirs with you. And then one step further, to have the courage to reach out and share your emotional experience with people you trust. It's a really powerful thing. One of the things that I have found to be a real positive for me during all of this is that I'm connecting with people that actually in my busy world, I seldom had the opportunity to before. And we're having very real conversations about the impact of this. And I'm even challenging myself to share a few of my own responses so that it's a real two-way conversation. So make space for that without putting pressure on yourselves to fix something for yourself or for the other person that you're talking with. And then I want to end on this article, which is really what sparked me to sort of anchor things around this theme today. So this is from an article, and this is from one study. If I had been responsible, I would have been able to say who this is attributed to, but I'm pulling it from an article. And it says, simply talking about our problems and sharing our negative emotions with someone we trust can be profoundly healing, reducing stress, strengthening our immune system, and reducing physical and emotional distress. I'm going to read it again. Simply talking about our problems, sharing our negative emotions with someone we trust can be profoundly healing, reducing stress, strengthening our immune system, and reducing physical and emotional distress. Nowhere in that quote did it say, and then feeling obligated to fix what's wrong. And what I'm hoping that we can start turning our conversation to as we buckle up and prepare ourselves for the long haul that's remaining before us after the governor's order is to be turning to each other and talking about how this feels, because that's profoundly healing individually for the people that we're talking to and to our community. I want to just say again that being a part of this school community has been profoundly meaningful and impactful for me on a professional and personal level. And it's such a privilege to work with all of you, to interact with members of the community, to enjoy the support of my senior leadership team and my colleagues, and to keep making space for these kinds of conversations. Thank you very much.
Now I have to unmute. Thank you, Raymond. Thank you very much. Are there questions that anyone has that they'd like to ask Mr. Pillsbury? And again, we're using the Q&A function that you'll find at the bottom of the screen for any of those interactions. Raymond, could you do this? There may be people who do want to direct questions. Would you tell people how to get in touch with you?
Of course, and I encourage you to do that. I welcome it. So my ridiculously long email address is rpillsbury, that's RPILLSBURY, at warriors.winnicunnet.org.
Great. Thank you. So again, our plan today, this is going to be a shorter one of our meetings today, because our plan was really to bring Raymond to you today and take a pause I mean, as I said at the beginning of this session, there are plenty of issues that we've been working at, that the governor's order brought on more quickly, with respect to the end of the year, summer, graduations, all those kinds of things. And you know, we'll absolutely be back next week to talk about those. We're talking about organizing one of these where we invite some or all of our elementary principals on, because I know some people have asked about them doing a similar kind of format. And we've talked about involving all of them in one of these sessions. There are lots of things to talk about, but quite frankly, I mean, personally for me, and I know for this group of people, I think we're sort of getting our arms around, you know, the sort of finality of the governor's order and what that now means to us going forward.
I see one question. I see one.
There is a question.
Right, there's a lot of great comments.
Thank yous, Raymond. Raymond, there's a lot of thank yous, well deserved.
But there is one question that's asked, where do you begin if you're feeling overwhelmed?
Yes.
So I think you begin where you are. And I think part of what is helpful is to first be sure that you're not judging yourself for that. As far as I'm concerned, feeling overwhelmed is a pretty understandable emotional reaction, as they all are. You know, there's this, it's a little bit cliche now in the counseling world, but there's this whole sort of strategy to name it, to tame it. There's just something really powerful to be able to say to somebody, I am so overwhelmed. And what I can only imagine is that overwhelmed feeling has all sorts of big parts. And it's not about any one particular thing, maybe, but about a whole host of things that are also probably well beyond your immediate control. You know, we find comfort in control. That's why, like I said earlier, we talk a lot about logistics at first, because those are things we can be in charge of. Those are things that we can wrap our heads around because they make more sense. Emotions aren't always that easy. So if you are reaching out to somebody that you trust and care about and just having the courage to say, I feel overwhelmed, and somebody's giving you space to do that without judging you and just connecting with you on a human level and listening to your concerns and thoughts. And you know, maybe part of that conversation turns to how you might get some relief in the form of self-care, or maybe the power is just to be able to have the courage to say it, and accept it for yourself a little bit, and then also know that people care about you and care about where you're coming from and what you need. I just think there's a lot of power in that. Now, I know that there are all sorts of things that we wish we could do to fix the way things are. You know, one of the things that's true about a crisis like this versus even Hurricane Harvey in Houston, you know, once the stormwaters receded in Houston, then the rebuilding had to begin. This is sort of one of these sort of long drawn out crises that just sort of keeps hanging on. And then things like the governor's announcement, which is important information for us, can also inflame that sort of crisis response again. I feel very overwhelmed. I feel extremely overwhelmed. And if it makes you feel any better, I spend a great deal of my day wondering how I'm going to get it all done and how I'm going to attend to the people that I care about in my personal and professional life. And that's a real feeling of powerlessness. I guess my suggestion is take charge of the things that are reasonable within your grasp to take charge of, even if it's just stepping up your self-care a little bit and then really calling it, I am doing my best and I am taking care of myself, and I am going to do everything I need to do to be okay. And when I'm not feeling okay, I'm going to reach out to somebody so that I can get some support.
Raymond, there's another question here, but I have a question that came to me via text. And that is what you would say to parents as they are attempting to help their their children, their students to cope?
Yeah, I think the conversation is the power, because, you know, I mentioned uncertainty. Even the best of experts in the world right now are uncertain. So if, you know, certainly as a parent, guardian, or caregiver, the answers aren't going to be readily available to you. I think conversations with your family or whomever you're living with about just how this feels. And I would go one step further for parents, guardians, and caregivers. Share a little of your own, not in such a way that's causing burden or distress for your kids, but to also help them to understand that talking about what you're feeling can provide tremendous relief. And you know, I've heard from lots of people about things that they've been doing. One of the things that has really resonated for me, and I'll share it with you to take or leave as you see fit, is a daily gratitude check. So very deliberately at the end of a day, perhaps sitting with your loved ones. I do that with my dogs. They don't have a lot to contribute, but it's still meaningful. Sitting with your loved ones and just talking without an agenda. The devices are closed, you're connecting with each other, and then perhaps you're ending on kind of a gratitude check. And you know, there's a lot of power in that. That's not to suggest that everybody has to put on a phony smile or just to pretend to get through things. There are so many things that we can still be grateful for, and there's a lot of power in being able to invite each other to talk about the things that are hard to talk about, but then also to recognize the things that are really meaningful and powerful for you right now.
It's interesting that now there are questions coming, which is great. I have one that's related, and there's one up earlier about a plan around grief and whatever, but I want to come back to that because this next question is really related. And someone's asking, you know, how do we help our seniors who are grieving the loss of their senior year, their spring sports seasons, and are already beginning to hear news that as they go off to college, they may not be going off to college because they may be starting that freshman year online.
Yep. So now that I've already given my presentation, I'm gonna say something a little bit more unfiltered. It's okay for everybody to be together and to say something like, "This really sucks." You know, I think sometimes, and we're guilty of this, you know, in leadership roles, sometimes we feel like we have to fancy it up a little bit too much. But by all means, be able to say to each other, "This is really hard. This is really sucky to not have what I have all of these years romanticized in my head about the end of my high school experience." But also recognizing that, so again, in the spirit of things not being one size fits all, not everybody has had that experience as well. So there's space for all sorts of different reactions. For some students, you know, because of my work in particular, I have a lot more access to this. For some students, this was a relief to not have to go through all the pageantry of their senior year and to be able to sort of quietly finish and move on to the next step for them. So everybody needs to be able to have space to call this what this is for them. You know, in the grief process, you know, there's a model out there that's been around for a long, long time by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross about the 5 stages of grief. I'll let you research that on your own. But the huge caveat to that is grief is not step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, and then 5, you get to acceptance and you're all done. Grief is a process that does a lot of looping. And in order to get to acceptance, bringing that grief into the light. And also grief is a longer process than crisis response. What we're doing right now is all sort of getting by and putting some emotional first aid in the mix, and doing everything that we can to set the stage for acceptance, to set the stage for resilience and perseverance. So I would see this as something that's sort of a longer term process, but it's all the better if you're talking about it as you go and just being honest and giving space for your seniors to be able to be honest as well without judgment.
Raymond, I didn't know you 10 years ago, but here's a question I wish I'd been able to ask you then. How do you get a team to talk about how they feel?
Yeah.
To
So
take notes.
yeah. So the short answer is, so when I first got into mental health back in so I was fresh out of college, and I was working in a community mental health center under a psychiatrist who was our sort of clinical supervisor, and he gave me the best piece of advice I've ever received professionally. And he said, sometimes the value is being at your post and making sure the person knows that you're there and you're ready when they are. So I say that because sometimes, you know, we end up as parents. I'm a parent as well. They've since flown the nest, but as parents, we feel this inordinate amount of pressure to fix and support and make better, much like we were able to do when they were babies and we could meet their very basic needs with comfort and care at that stage. So that never leaves us as parents, generally speaking. So it can be very powerless and discouraging and frustrating. And it can also leave us feeling really guilty as parents. So both of you be at your post. I'm here. I'm ready to talk when you are, and just keep kind of gently going at it. Teens also, they're spending an inordinate amount of time online right now, but many of them do anyway. Have them email you. Have them write something that they are thinking and feeling down for you, and then ask them, how would you like me to respond to this? Do you want me to just read it and you know, more in the spirit of listen? Or do you want me to make comments? Do you want us to pick up a conversation? Do you want to leave it be and come back to it? Asking some permissions like, can I check back in with you? So it's that whole creating space rather than pressure. The more pressure we put on ourselves and the more I shoulds, the more debilitating our efforts to be compassionate with one another can be.
Raymond, somebody getting great text this morning as well, as always, but someone's reminded me to just remind people that our counselors, social workers are available. They have office hours. If your students wish to schedule time with any of them to talk, those people are available to do that. And I think it's the last question I have here for now. Anyhow, we still take questions. And this may be for you as well, Dr. Arakelian. It's about do we have a plan in place to discuss grief and loss? Students may be experiencing illness in their families, perhaps even as this continues on, death of loved ones or family members. How do we support students remotely during this very difficult time?
Well, I would echo what you said, Dr. Lupini, as far as reaching out. We want to be a community. We want to be here for our families and offer support however we can, but we also don't want to overstep into people's personal lives. So we want to strike that balance and definitely be here for you. I know that counselors are actively reaching out to families, particularly those families who are struggling with having students participate in some of the academic work, because we just want to make sure that we're reaching out to kids and we're connecting with kids. It's part of the reason why we encouraged our staff to increase connection with our students, because we want to make sure that we're offering the support that we have for them. As far as grief and loss, that is something that, you know, longer term, we want to make sure that we're creating an environment, whether it's like this remotely to be supportive for kids, or, you know, longer term when we're in the buildings, we work together to make sure behind the scenes that people are aware of what kids are going through, whether it's just having a bad weekend or if it's a more traumatic longer term issue that kids are dealing with. We want to make sure that all their teachers are aware so we can respond and keep our expectations of kids in check when they're faced with lots of other things on their plate, and they're trying to navigate all those emotions while still trying to be kids and come to school and all of those things. So that's what we do. And I agree, reaching out to your counselor in your building. Sometimes it's who you have a connection with. Sometimes it's the nurse. Sometimes it's your favorite science teacher. Sometimes it's your coach. But reaching out and making those connections are things that are really important, particularly now when isolation can look differently for different kids depending on the resources they have. Raymond, would you like to respond to?
Yeah, I think it's really important to echo what Dr. Lupini and Dr. Arakelian said about our counselors. What a phenomenal group of human beings. So just to make a distinction for you, crisis response work is really just sort of the frontline first aid kind of response. And then what we try to do is to encourage kids and community members to then also reach out to and connect with their follow-up supports. So the kind of work that, so I professionally, I have been a counselor for many, many years, the bulk of which has been a school counselor. So I had two hats. So when I did crisis response work, I then supported kids with recognizing when they needed to enlist other resources. I can't say too many times or emphasize too much how fortunate we are to have the counseling resources that we have in our schools, but also the relationships with resources outside of schools and in the communities, so that when a school counselor is working with a student and they really feel strongly that it would be beneficial for the student to get additional mental health care, we have those standing relationships that we can sort of bridge the student to and the families to in order to be sure that they're getting the support that they need. So I do crisis response sort of Band-Aid work now in particular, but then I talk a lot about recognizing when you know you need to get some extra help that's beyond just confiding in somebody for a little extra support, really knowing when this is taking a toll on your emotional well-being and when the assistance from a professional would be really essential to seek out.
Great, thank you. So, well, let me just say one word there. I just want to acknowledge this. There is a question on here about a different topic this morning. Let me just say that this session was devoted really to these issues. The question that's posed, we are aware of that issue and are attempting to work with people who are putting that issue forward to talk about it. It has to do with taxes and all of those kinds of issues. We are talking about it. If you who asked the question, if you want to contact me directly, I'm happy to answer that for you. To wrap up here, so I can't say it better than this last comment, Raymond, which says, "This has been enormously helpful for me. Thank you so much. We are so fortunate to have Raymond in our school system." And if I know there's a feature where we can add sort of, we like that question or like that comment. I think I speak for all the people on screen with you right now that we would all give one of these to that question. Personally, I just want to say that Raymond, I think we're also lucky to be able to work with you, and I appreciate the opportunity to work with you so much. You've brought great things to my practice, and I think pretty much the other people, I see some nodding heads, all agree, and we're lucky to have you in SAU 21. So thank you. And for all of you out there, thank you again for joining us. We really appreciate it. We hope these are helpful. As we've said, we want to keep, we'll keep doing these sessions for as long as people are interested in coming and talking with us about the issues. I hope you all have a wonderful weekend and that you you find time for yourselves and to take care of yourselves in this very difficult time, and that you take these days to be able to do that. Thank you to my colleagues for being here this morning. And again, thank you, Raymond, for all your work and for joining us. Take care.